The girl on the auction platform didn't cry, but Elias knew she was drowning. Elias Brogan sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low, his coat collar turned against the sting of grit riding the breeze. Dry River Bend lay behind him, a faint memory of hooves in the dirt and smoke curling from the chimney. He hadn't planned to ride into San Lazaro Crossing that morning, but something had drawn him. Not hunger, not business, just the strange pull of the road, a whisper beneath the hooves. Maybe. Something older than reason. He hadn't been into town since Christmas, and even then, he hadn't stayed long. These streets didn't hold much for a man like him, not anymore. But as his gelding paced the muddy edge of Main Street, the familiar clap of boots on Timber Boardwalk and the rustle of a tattered flag above the sheriff's post struck a chord in him, like a bell buried deep and almost forgotten. Elias kept one gloved hand on the saddle horn and looked toward the crowd gathering in the center of town. Men with dust-stiff coats and cracked boots had formed a loose semicircle near the old freight platform, where the rail once threatened to connect San Lazaro to anything civilized. Now it was just a place for shouting, dealing, and forgetting. He tugged gently on the reins and let the horse slow to a stop, standing in the shade of a leaning signpost that once read, "Cobbler, repairs while you wait." The paint was long gone, like most things here. Then he heard it. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" the auctioneer's voice rang out, cutting the air clean like a knife drawn too fast from its sheath. The voice pulled something sharp in Elias's chest. He didn't want to look, didn't want to know what kind of sin San Lazaro was up to now, but he turned his head anyway. A makeshift platform had been raised on old freight crates, and a girl stood upon it barefoot, arms crossed over her belly. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders, threadbare and torn at the hem. Hair the color of sand in morning light fell in tangled ropes across her face, hiding the worst of her shame. She couldn't have been more than 17, and she was heavy with child. A flicker of movement to the left, Elias spotted the auctioneer, hat cocked, hands dancing in rhythm with the rising bids. Then the woman behind him, counting notes with quick, bird-like fingers, older, harder. Her mother, probably. That much was clear in the sharpness of the nose and the matching scowl etched into her jaw. The crowd jeered, laughed, called out amounts like they were wagering on a game of cards. Elias didn't move. Then he heard a name from the man beside him, Sheriff Jed Monroe, standing with his boots apart and thumbs tucked lazy into his belt. "That's Lavinia Wynn's girl," Jed said under his breath, watching the scene like he might watch two coyotes circling each other. Clara. Shame about her situation, but folks say she got herself there. Elias didn't answer. He just stared. That name Clara, it landed with a weight he couldn't explain. He shifted in the saddle. "2 for the price of 1, the auctioneer crowed. Strong arms. Good stock. Already proven, if you catch my meaning. The men roared. Some of them he recognized. Harlan Skegg, with his drooping mustache and saloon stink. Tib Whitlow, the one who ran women out past the stockyards. Their voices louder than most. Their hunger louder still. Clara didn't cry. Not that Elias could see. But she looked down at her feet like they weren't hers. And her hands. God. Her hands rested gently on her belly. Protective. Defiant, even. That did something to him. He remembered another pair of hands. Softer. Humming against a quilt while a fire crackled behind her. Emma. His wife. The child they lost. The fever that had come like a thief in the night. Back when Dry River Bend was still young, and the world still held some hope. Harlan Skegg raised a hand. 200. Tib countered with 3. Elias felt the air change in his lungs. His heart kicked once, then again, like a horse testing the reins. 4, Skegg said, licking his lips. The girl didn't flinch, but her chin quivered ever so slightly. The silence that followed was deeper than the canyon behind his ranch. Then Elias heard himself say it. $500. The words didn't tremble. They rang out like a shot. The crowd turned. Even Jed straightened. Elias didn't blink, didn't move. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. 500. Do I hear 6? No one answered. Skegg spat in the dirt. Tib cursed and turned his back. 500 going once, going twice. The auctioneer's grin cracked wide as he slammed the gavel down on the crate. Sold to Mr. Elias Brogan. There was grumbling, but no protest. Most folks weren't about to argue with the man from Dry River Bend, not when he stared the way he did, like a man who'd already lost everything once and didn't mind doing it again if need be. Elias swung down from the saddle and stepped forward. Lavinia Wynne was already there, her fingers twitching like she couldn't wait to feel the weight of that money. You got it on you, Mr. Brogan. He didn't answer, just unlatched the pouch at his hip and counted the bills, slow, deliberate. Her eyes devoured each one as it hit her palm. She's a good worker, Lavinia said quickly. Won't give you no trouble. Strong, obedient, and she can cook. What's her name, Elias asked. That stopped her. Lavinia blinked. Clara Wynne, though I suppose you can call her what you like now. She turned and vanished into the crowd without another word. Not so much as a glance back. Elias stood alone at the foot of the platform. Clara hadn't moved. She looked at him like a person staring down a storm, braced, silent, resigned. He took off his hat. Miss Wynne, he said, voice soft like stepping through frost. My name is Elias Brogan. I know this situation is frightening. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I don't believe in buying people, he went on. I don't believe anyone should have been up there at all. But I wasn't about to let you end up with one of them. She still didn't speak, but her eyes moved, flicked to the crowd, then back to him. Measuring. I have a ranch north of here, he said. Dry River Bend. It's quiet. You'd be safe there. I could use help in the house. You could use shelter. That's all. She studied him. He didn't push. Finally, she nodded once. All right. Mr. Brogan, she said. Voice so quiet he had to lean forward to catch it. I'll come with you. They walked to the wagon slowly. Elias helped her climb aboard, his hands careful not to brush too close. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The wheels creaked as they rolled past the townsfolk. No one met their eyes. No one offered a blessing. But the wind, that wild spring wind, whistled low through the eaves of the old blacksmith's shop, and as it danced across the high ridge above town, it carried something with it, something Elias couldn't name, but felt in the hollow of his bones. He held the reins in silence. But inside, something had cracked open. The wagon rolled over the broken trail that led out of San Lazaro Crossing, its wheels creaking beneath the weight of silence. Elias Brogan held the reins loosely, guiding the horse with one hand, the other resting quietly on his thigh. Dust rose behind them in soft swirls, catching the sun's dying light. Ahead, the road narrowed between rock spines, and the sky turned the color of old pennies, streaked with purple and gold. Clara sat beside him on the hard bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since agreeing to come. Her eyes stayed forward, unblinking, as if afraid they might land on something that would pull her backward again. Elias noticed the way she gripped the thin shawl around her shoulders. The evening air had turned, bringing a chill that slipped through seams and buttons, without a word. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a folded wool blanket, offering it to her with a slow gesture. She took it, hesitated, then wrapped it carefully around her shoulders. Still. She said nothing. The trail dipped into a hollow where cottonwoods bent low over the dry riverbed. Somewhere in the branches, a crow called once and fell silent. The sun had dropped behind the bluffs now, casting everything in blue and gray. They made camp just off the road, beneath a grove of twisted juniper trees where the wind whispered like a ghost through the branches. Elias unhitched the horse, tethered it to a low branch, then set about building a small fire. Clara stood apart, arms crossed, eyes darting with every snap of twig and gust of wind. "I've got bread," Elias said quietly, more to the fire than to her, "and jerky. Not much else. But it'll hold you till morning." She didn't answer. Her silence was a wall, thick, high, carefully built. He respected it. Let it stand. He laid the bread on a flat stone near the flames, letting it warm while he poured water into a tin cup. The air smelled of sage and smoke, and the fire crackled as if trying to fill the quiet between them. After a time, she sat near the fire, her legs drawn up beneath her, the blanket wrapped tight. Her face, in the flickering light, looked older than 17, drawn, hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken with more than weariness, her gaze fixed on the flames. But Elias knew her thoughts were far from here. "You've been through more than you should have," he said softly. "And I know you got no reason to trust me. But you'll find no harm in my house." Her eyes lifted then, slowly, like a shutter opening. She looked at him not long, but long enough to see he meant it. He passed her the warm bread. And this time, she took it. Her hands trembled slightly as she ate, chewing carefully, as if unsure when the next meal would come. They sat like that for a while, the firelight painting orange shapes on the low branches and the rocks nearby. A coyote yipped somewhere far off. Elias didn't move. Finally, her voice came small, rough, as though it hadn't been used in days. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't a challenge. It was a wound laid bare, raw and aching. He turned his head slowly to meet her eyes. "Nothing," he said. "But I'll wait as long as it takes until you believe it." She watched him for a long moment. Her breath was shallow, but steady. The fire popped, sending a spark skyward. Clara looked back at the flames. "My ma said I was a mistake," she said finally, voice barely louder than the wind. "Said the baby proved it." She was wrong. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a tin of tobacco. He rolled a cigarette by the firelight, his movements slow and practiced. After he lit it, he let the smoke drift upward before speaking again. "I lost a wife once, Emma, and a baby with her." He said nothing more, and he didn't need to. That name Emma carried enough sorrow in it to speak volumes. Clara's shoulders softened, just a little. She stretched her legs toward the fire, the blanket slipping slightly. Elias noticed then how thin she was beneath the bulk of pregnancy. Her wrists looked like kindling, her face gaunt. "When did it happen?" she asked. 15 years ago. Long time. Feels like yesterday." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. The fire flared, then settled again. "You married Clara?" asked suddenly. "Once. You ever think about it again?" He flicked ash into the dirt. I think about what I lost more than what I could have. Clara shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. Why'd you do it? She asked after a long pause. Back there. $500 that's more than most folks have. Elias looked up at the stars, just beginning to push through the twilight. I saw the look in your eyes, and I couldn't watch it happen again. Not to you. She was silent for a long while. Then, softly, she whispered, I didn't cry. Not once. You held yourself like someone who'd already cried enough. He stood and stirred the fire with a stick, letting the coals settle. The night air deepened, and the first fingers of frost touched the ground. You can sleep in the wagon, he said. There's a wool lining in the bed. I'll stay here by the fire. Clara hesitated, then rose. She walked to the wagon, stepped up, and paused. The firelight caught her face just enough for Elias to see the tears that had started. Silent and sudden. She turned away quickly, climbing inside, and the wagon canvas rustled shut behind her. Elias leaned back against a tree. Cigarette nearly spent. He didn't expect gratitude, didn't want it. What he wanted was something deeper, something he hadn't dared name for a long time. He sat watching the stars grow bolder in the dark sky, the wind playing through the trees like fingers across old strings. And for the first time in many years, he didn't feel entirely alone. She turns her face from the firelight, but he sees the tear slip down her cheek anyway. The ranch appeared out of the dust like something abandoned, waiting to be remembered. By the time the wagon crested the last rise, and the jagged edges of Dry River Bend came into view, the sun hung low in the western sky, casting long, rust-colored shadows across the valley floor. Clara sat quietly beside Elias, one hand braced on the seat as the wheels dipped into every rut and dry groove along the winding trail. She had barely spoken since waking that morning, though the color in her face had returned some with the food and rest. Elias glanced toward her without turning his head. The wind had tangled her hair into loose knots, and her eyes, though clearer now, still darted with every jolt of the wagon. He recognized that look, the instinct of someone used to waiting for the next bad thing to come around the bend. The house came into view slowly, like a secret being revealed, a 2-story frame structure with weathered white siding, its paint blistered by sun and time. A lean-to porch hugged the front, sagging slightly to one side, and beside it stood a tall barn with wide doors open to the wind. Beyond the barn, fencing snaked across the land in lazy lines, half buried in weeds and patches of stubborn grass. Clara narrowed her eyes as she took it all in, saying nothing. Elias brought the wagon to a stop near the porch. The silence settled heavy between them as he climbed down and rounded the front. He offered a hand, but she hesitated, then took it. Her palm was dry, small, and cold. "This is it," Elias said, his voice quiet, even reverent. Dry River Bend. She stepped down onto the packed dirt and looked around slowly. The breeze caught her dress and lifted it just slightly, revealing cracked shoes and swollen ankles. She rubbed her arms as she surveyed the empty yard, the faded porch swing, the rows of ghost grass dancing in the wind. "It's quiet," she said, as though testing the word. Been that way a long time. Inside. The house smelled of cedar, old wood, and something else faint and floral, like dried lavender. Elias led her through the front door and into a wide, plain room where a fireplace sat cold and empty. A bookshelf ran along one wall, mostly bare, but for a few ragged volumes and a wooden box carved with simple flowers. He stopped near the staircase and pointed toward a room at the end of the hall. "That'll be yours, closest to the stove in winter. I'll be up top." Clara stepped through the doorway and looked around. The room held a small bed with a patchwork quilt folded neatly on top. A dresser stood in the corner, and a single oil lamp waited on the sill. She ran her fingers along the edge of the dresser, noting the worn knobs, the way the drawers stuck just a little. "There's food in the root cellar," Elias added, still standing in the doorway, "and water from the pump just out back. I'll see to the horse." He turned and left her there. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked beneath her weight, and dust puffed from the seams. She laid a hand on her belly, feeling the faint movement within soft, like drifting leaves. She closed her eyes and breathed in deep, letting the stillness wrap around her. In the barn. Elias busied himself brushing down the gelding. Though his hands moved slower than usual, his thoughts kept circling back to the way Clara had stood in the doorway, small and uncertain, but with something in her posture that reminded him of standing water still on the surface, but deep and unreadable beneath. That evening, as dusk slipped into full night, he lit a fire in the hearth and set out 2 plates of stew. Clara appeared in the doorway just as he ladled the last of it into the bowl. Her hair had been brushed, though it still hung uneven, and her face looked washed, her cheeks slightly pink from the cold water at the pump. They ate in near silence, broken only by the crackle of flame and the soft clink of spoons. Elias didn't press conversation. He watched her movements, how she ate slowly, methodically, like someone used to stretching small meals. Afterward, she helped him clear the table without being asked, when she took the plates to the wash basin. She paused, holding one dish in her hands. "This place," she said, "feels like it belonged to someone else." He nodded once. "It did. Your wife. Emma." She set the plate down gently. "What was she like?" Elias stirred the fire with the iron poker, staring into the dancing embers. "Kind," he said. Quick to laugh. She sang when she worked, said it made the chores go faster. Clara looked down at her hands. "She died here." He nodded again. "In this house. Right where you're sleeping." She didn't flinch. Instead, she said softly, "Then I'll take care of it like it was mine." Later that night, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain tapped against the windows like fingertips, and wind howled through the eaves. Elias woke to the sound of floorboards creaking outside his door. He opened it and found Clara standing there, wrapped in her blanket, face pale in the dark. "Couldn't sleep," she whispered. He nodded once and stepped aside. "Come down. Fire's still warm." They sat near the hearth again, the light flickering across their faces. She didn't speak at first, only watched the flames. Her eyes eventually drifted to the shelves nearby, to the wooden box with its floral carvings. She reached out slowly and lifted the lid. Inside was a music box, small, brass, and faded. She turned the key gently, and the mechanism clicked to life. A soft, halting melody began to play, broken in places, but still sweet. The tune filled the quiet room with something delicate and strangely familiar. Clara's face changed. Her eyes filled with something older than memory. She turned to Elias, her voice low and careful. "My grandmother used to hum this," she said. "When I was small. Said it came from her mother's hands. Passed down." Elias's jaw tightened. He leaned forward. "That belonged to Emma," he said. "Her mother gave it to her before she crossed into Arizona. Said it was all she had left of home." Clara looked at the music box again, as if it might answer something she hadn't yet asked. The wind rattled the shutters once more, and the fire let out a sigh. She looked up, and for the first time, her voice was steady. "Why do you still have this?" There's a silence that settles when someone stops expecting pain and starts waiting for hope. The spring wind had calmed by morning, leaving behind a hush that stretched across the valley like a blanket. A blue haze clung to the ridge behind Dry River Bend, and from the porch Elias Brogan watched it drift, a mug of weak coffee warming his hands. Somewhere behind him, he could hear Clara moving softly through the kitchen, the gentle clink of tin cups and the creak of the old cabinet door. It had been 3 weeks since she arrived, and each day she'd moved a little quieter, a little closer to trust. He hadn't answered her question the night she found the music box. Instead, he'd let the tune finish its halting melody, then closed the lid and returned it to the shelf. Clara hadn't pressed. She'd only nodded, her face unreadable in the firelight, and returned to her room. But that night, something had shifted between them, something unspoken, but real. Now, as he stood watching the slow rise of morning over the broken fence line, he heard the back door open behind him. Clara stepped out, her shawl drawn over her shoulders, one hand supporting the small of her back. She moved slower these days, each step measured by the growing weight of the child she carried. "The sky's clear," she said. He nodded. "Spring's early this year." They stood there a while, neither speaking much. The sound of wind chimes, ones Elias hadn't heard in years, fluttered from the barn rafters. Clara glanced at them and smiled faintly. "I like that sound," she murmured. "Used to have one just like it. My father carved it from scrap wood, said it kept bad dreams away. You remember him?" She nodded, though her expression darkened. "He died when I was 6. After that, there wasn't much good left in the house." Elias sipped from his mug and said nothing. He knew that kind of emptiness, the one that settles after someone leaves and everything familiar turns against you. Inside the house, the kettle began to whistle. Clara turned to go, and Elias followed. That day passed slow and quiet. Elias mended the east fence, hammering new nails into old wood while the sun beat down through a high, cloudless sky. Clara worked in the house, cleaning shelves that hadn't been touched in years, resorting cupboards, setting things in order. She'd found a rhythm in the place, and it showed in how she moved less like a guest, more like someone reclaiming a space. By late afternoon, Elias came in through the back door, the smell of sun on his coat. Clara was kneading dough at the kitchen table, her sleeves rolled back and a smear of flour across her cheek. "You're making bread," he said, almost surprised. "It's what I know," she replied. "There's comfort in it." He nodded, washed up at the basin, and helped stoke the fire in the stove. They ate together that evening, real food this time, cornbread hot from the oven, beans simmered slow with bits of smoked beef. Elias poured water into 2 mismatched cups, and they sat in the lamplight, eating in companionable silence. After the meal, they took their mugs onto the porch, watching as the last of the light slid behind the ridge. Clara leaned against the railing, one hand resting on her belly. "He moves more at night," she said, "like he's waiting for quiet." "He's got good sense, then," Elias murmured. She turned her face to him, shadowed and soft. "What were you like before all this?" He hesitated. "Quieter. Meaner. Maybe. The war took things from me. Emma gave some of it back." "She must have loved you something fierce," Clara said. "She did. And now." He looked at her fully then, studying her face in the dusk, the resilience there, the lines of tiredness around her eyes, the unshaken protectiveness in her hands. I think she'd be glad I found something worth saving again. Clara looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. And you think I'm worth saving? I wouldn't have done what I did if I didn't. Silence fell between them. But it was no longer the kind filled with fear or mistrust. It was something warmer, like waiting on the first rain after a long, dry spell. Later, as the moon rose and stars scattered overhead, Elias sat at the edge of his bed, turning something over in his hand. A small carved band, a ring. Once his father's, passed down through silence and hard work. He set it on the table beside the lamp and stared at it for a long time. The next morning brought clouds and the promise of rain. Clara stood in the parlor near the window, brushing her hair when Elias entered. He paused in the doorway. Elias had spent the night staring at the ceiling, counting every breath as if it could shape a different future. By dawn, he knew silence wouldn't be enough anymore. I need to ask you something, he said. She turned, eyes watchful. I don't want you to think this is payment, he began. And it ain't out of duty either. I want you here because I want you not just to stay, but to build something. He stepped forward and held out the ring. I know what it means to be lost, Clara, but I also know what it means to be found, and this time, I want it to be by choice. Marry me not for shelter, not for debt, but because we're no longer alone. She stared at the ring, and something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, disbelief, hope. I don't know how to be someone's wife, she whispered. Elias looked into her frightened eyes and replied, Then we'll learn it together. Some weddings don't need music or crowds, just a promise spoken where the land can hear it. The morning broke warm and pale, with a thin veil of fog still lifting off the grass around Dry River Bend. A hush blanketed the ranch, the kind of calm that only came before something new began. Inside the house, Clara stood before the cracked mirror in the small bedroom, brushing out her hair with slow, thoughtful strokes. She wore a simple calico dress, faded lilac, with a faint pattern of wildflowers. It wasn't white, but it was clean, and it was hers. On the small side table sat an embroidered handkerchief, its edges yellowed but neatly folded. Elias had laid it there without a word the night before. She recognized the initials stitched into the corner E.B. Emma's hand. No doubt. The thought tightened Clara's chest, but she didn't shy from it. Outside, Elias stood near the wagon, tying off the canvas cover. He wore his best shirt, blue cotton, tucked into clean denim and boots that had been shined for the first time in years. His jaw was freshly shaved, though he'd nicked himself once under the chin and now wore a strip of cloth there, spotted with blood. He didn't mind. His hands trembled only slightly as he adjusted the reins. They rode in silence to the edge of San Lazaro Crossing. The morning road still soft from yesterday's rain. The landscape glistened faintly in the sun, dewdrops clinging to the fence rails and sagebrush. Birds wheeled overhead, calling out across the empty plains. Clara kept a hand resting over the curve of her belly, eyes fixed ahead. The church in town was modest, its pinewood exterior bleached gray from years of sun. A steeple leaned slightly, and the bell above it no longer rang. Its rope had frayed and snapped 2 winters ago, but the inside smelled of beeswax and old hymnals, and the morning light filtered through the narrow windows like spilled gold. Dr. Alcott, the town's aging physician, met them at the steps. He offered Clara a quiet, fatherly smile and held out his arm without asking. She took it, her fingers tightening just slightly on the worn sleeve of his coat. Inside, the Reverend Roy Harlan waited by the altar, He was a tall man with a hollow voice, but his words held weight when they needed to. Only a few townsfolk had gathered Mrs. Ellen from the Mercantile, a pair of older ranchers who'd done business with Elias before, and a widowed schoolteacher who held her hat with both hands and wept quietly, without knowing why. There was no music, no lace, no flowers, but there was stillness and light, and the sound of wind through the rafters. Elias turned to face Clara as she stepped forward, her hands folded, her shoulders squared, not with pride, but with the kind of quiet strength built from surviving things no one ever should. The Reverend began with the scripture, his voice low, echoing slightly against the wooden walls. Then he looked to Elias, who cleared his throat. "I reckon I ain't a man of many words," he said, "but I know what it means to lose and to find. Clara, you gave me back something I never thought I'd see again, if you'll have me. I'll spend what time I've got left making sure you never doubt what you're worth." Clara looked at him, tears pooling but not falling. "I was never taught how to trust," she said, "but you gave me space to breathe. You never asked more than I could give, and never let me feel small. I want to raise our boy where peace is louder than pain." Reverend Harlan nodded once, and with a few final words, declared them husband and wife. They didn't kiss, not right away. Elias took her hands instead, pressing them between his palms, and something in his face shifted relief, gratitude, awe. Then Clara stepped forward and kissed his cheek, and it was more than enough. Outside the church, the few attendees offered handshakes, brief blessings, and baskets of fresh bread, preserves, and folded cloths. It wasn't much, but it felt like plenty. By midday, they were back at the ranch. Elias helped Clara from the wagon and held her hand as they walked up the porch steps. She paused just before the door, looking at the porch swing. It creaked in the breeze, as if it had been waiting for her. She stepped forward and sat. Elias joined her. The wind carried the scent of coming rain and the last blooms of desert honeysuckle. Chickens clucked softly in the distance, and inside the house. The oil lamp by the mantel flickered against the glass frame that still held Emma's picture. Neither spoke. Later. After dinner sparse but warm, they sat by the hearth, the baby shifting beneath Clara's ribs. "He's strong," she said, smiling softly. "Gets it from you." She took his hand then, placed it gently on her belly. "He's kicking," she whispered. Elias stilled. The sensation struck like thunder beneath his skin life. Real and waiting. His eyes filled, and he couldn't stop them. Clara leaned against him, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. "I think she'd be proud," she murmured. "She would," Elias said, voice rough. "And so am I." The fire dimmed, shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the boards. But inside, all was quiet, save for the sound of breath and the tiny, persistent kick beneath Elias's hand. "Clara," Elias murmured into the dark, "I don't think I ever really lived until today. Legacy isn't built in one season. It's etched slowly into the bones of the land." The sun sat low behind the hills at Dry River Bend, painting long shadows across the porch where Micah Brogan stood, a boy, no longer. At 17, he had the height of Elias, the quiet of Clara, and the eyes of someone who'd listened more than he'd spoken. His hands were calloused now, shaped by reins and saw handles, but it was the carved initials in the porch beam that held his attention that evening. E+C, faded, but still proud beneath the cracked paint. He traced them with one thumb, slowly, carefully, as if they might vanish if handled too rough. Behind him, children's laughter echoed faintly, his own running circles through the tall grass, chasing fireflies as night crept in. The sound stirred something deep in his chest. He turned toward the door and stepped inside. Clara sat at the kitchen table, older now but not dimmed. Her hair had streaked with silver, and the lines at her eyes ran deeper, but her posture held steady. Across from her, Emma Rose and Daniel, Micah's younger siblings, played a game with colored pebbles, their heads bent together like twins born of the same root. Elias sat in his rocker by the fireplace, the soft creak of wood against wood a familiar comfort in the background. His eyes followed Micah's movements as he passed, the same watchful gaze he'd offered since the boy was first laid in his arms. Micah poured water from the jug, took a seat, and folded his hands around the glass. He looked across at Clara, then down at the table. "There's something I want to know," he said. She looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded, her fingers stilling on the tablecloth. "You're old enough now," she said softly. Elias said nothing. He only reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a small wooden box, the same one that had once held the music box, now resting quietly on the mantel. Clara opened it, removing a folded piece of paper brittle with age, worn soft at the edges. She passed it to Micah. "This," she said, "is where your story begins." Micah opened the note, reading the neat, faded writing. It was a list of names, bidders, prices, a date the spring of 1887. He looked up slowly. Micah looked up, eyes wide. The paper shook slightly in his hand. Was I bought? I don't understand." Clara placed a hand over his. "You were not born into safety. You were bought out of danger. There was a day, back in San Lazaro Crossing, when your life could have gone the way of dust." But Elias stood up. "He didn't know me. He didn't know you. But he saw what others looked away from." Micah's face tightened. "So, he chose us." Elias finally spoke, voice like worn leather. "That's right." Micah was quiet for a long while. Then, a slow smile crept across his face, the same crooked grin that had charmed the town since he was knee-high. "Then I guess I'm the luckiest kid in Wyoming territory," he said. "Not every boy gets chosen by a man as good as P." The room went still. Then Clara laughed, and Elias shook his head. But his eyes shone with something more than humor, something like grace. Years passed. The ranch grew fields rich with grain, cattle strong and thick across the northern pasture. Daniel and Emma Rose took to the land the way fish take to water. Micah built his own house just west of the main homestead, married a girl from Cold Hollow, raised sons and daughters of his own. But every summer evening, when the day cooled and the sky burned orange, the whole family gathered on the original porch. 3 generations, 1 house, the same wind whispering through the fence rails. Micah would sit with his youngest grandchild on his knee, rocking slow as the sun dipped low. The little one would ask for a story, as they always did. And Micah would begin not with kings or cowboys, but with an auction platform and a girl in torn calico. "Your great-grandfather," he'd say, "wasn't the richest man in the territory, wasn't the strongest, but he was the kind that didn't look away when he saw someone drowning. He chose to be the answer to someone's prayer." The porch would fall still as he spoke, and even the wind seemed to lean in. He'd tell them how Elias Brogan had seen Clara not as a burden, but as a beginning. How love, once lost, had found its way back through courage and silence. How a boy not yet born had been carried home that day. And sometimes, when the words got heavy, Clara herself would step outside, gray-haired and regal, and sit beside Micah, her hand in his. She never corrected the story, never added to it. She didn't need to, because some truths are carved not with words, but with years. As the sun dipped, and stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Elias Brogan sat in his chair, rocking slow, his youngest grandchild curled against his chest. His hands were marked with time scars from war, calluses from work, spots from age. But when he looked out over the land and the people gathered, there was no sorrow in him, only peace. And as the cicadas hummed and the wind rustled the corn, Elias Brogan closed his eyes, his heart finally whole beneath the endless western sky. And so the wind still moves across Dry River Bend, whispering through fence slats and over the worn porch steps where names were once carved by a man with heavy hands and a heart full of second chances. And if you listen closely, on a quiet evening, just before the stars prick open the sky, you might still hear the creak of that old swing or the soft laugh of a woman who once feared she'd be forgotten. The kind of sound that stays with a place long after voices fade. And sometimes you catch a scent, cornbread and cedar, or the leather polish from a saddle left hanging too long, and it draws something up in you didn't know was waiting. Because some stories don't end, they settle, like dust on the windowsill of a house built from grief and mended by grace. And maybe that's all we ever really want, isn't it? To know that we mattered in the quiet corners of someone else's life, like a scar that became a map instead of a wound. Like a hand reached out, not for taking, but to keep someone from falling. And if you remember anything about Elias Brogan, remember that he didn't go looking for salvation, but when it crossed his path, he didn't look away. And that kind of thing, well, it echoes, it carries, like the sound of hooves on frostbitten ground, or a lullaby hummed low under breath, never quite forgotten, even when the name of the singer's long gone. And Clara, well, she was the kind of woman you write songs about but never sell, the kind you pass along in hushed tones between the rustle of pages and the flicker of an oil lamp. A girl turned, mother turned pillar, whose silence spoke louder than sermons. And if the world ever tried to forget her, it couldn't, not while there are children raised on stories of rightness done in shadows, of love that didn't start in fireworks but in bread offered warm, and music boxes wound slowly, and long rides through the dust with no promises but the ones that matter. And there was that boy Micah, with his lopsided grin, and the way he held his children like they were made of sun, and the way he said P like it was more than a letter. It was a vow. And maybe you remember how Elias's coat stayed by the door even after the man himself was gone, or how the bell in San Lazaro never rang again. But folks swore they heard it once, clear and true, the day Clara gave her boy his name, or how the wind chimes in the barn started playing again that spring, like someone wanted to be sure no bad dreams crossed that threshold. And there's something to be said about places where things like that still happen, where legacies aren't carved in stone, but in supper shared, in stories retold, in truth protected not by proof but by presence. And maybe the lessons this honor doesn't vanish just because it goes unnoticed. It waits, like the twilight over the mesa, like letters you never mailed, like forgiveness unspoken but lived every day. And justice, well, she doesn't always wear boots or a badge. Sometimes she looks like a girl with a swollen belly standing on a platform, who walks away from shame into a house that says, stay. And what would the world be like if more folks did what Elias did not with noise, but with stillness, with steady hands and eyes that don't flinch? And I reckon you might be asking if it's worth still believing in that sort of thing. In men who ride through cold towns and offer nothing but their word, and women who stand straight though the world's tried to bend them, and children who grow up learning that love don't come from blood. It comes from choice. And if you believe that too, even a little, I invite you to mark it down. Leave the number 1 key below if this story stirred something old and good in you. And if you want to hear more tales like this, tales that rise from dust and ride out past the horizon, then saddle up with us here at Western Story Chronicles, where memory walks hand in hand with mercy, where the West ain't just a place, it's a way of remembering. And may you sleep tonight knowing that somewhere out there, beneath a quilt stitched by quiet hands, someone found their way home, and someone stayed, and somewhere a porch still waits with room for one more story to be told.